backdrop, and this is utterly summary, is the 18th and 19th centuries, where we have a starting point, and it goes obviously back vastly before that, where international relations is based in sovereign governments' rights to wage war and to oppress and abuse internal populations. And the record of the millennia thus constituted a bloody mass with plenty of both war and violations of human rights. Against that backdrop, at the very end of the 19th century, comes the First Hague Conference in 1899. 26 nations gather, and they reach modest agreements about rules of conduct in war between sovereign nations. And they create an embryonic international court to arbitrate disputes among nations. For our purposes, for Nuremberg purposes, for international law purposes, that moment at the end of the 19th century is a starting point in this span of 100+ years. The second period I'd like to take you to is literally 100 years ago, the year 1907. The United States had previously called, President Theodore Roosevelt had called, for a second Hague Conference. Its principal objective from the United States perspective as a convening nation would be to create an empowered, more effective international court of arbitration among and between nations, building on the embryonic early first international court. And as a secondary objective, the United States sought that second Hague Conference to develop and advance rules of armed conflict. There was some delay in actually convening that meeting. It had to wait for the end of the Russo-Japanese War. And in the meantime, during that delay period, there was also the Boer War, waged in South Africa against British colonial rule. But eventually, and the formality is interesting, the inviting sovereign was the Tsar of Russia. Eventually, the Second Hague Conference convenes. June 15th, 1907 is the first formal session. 44 nations are represented, which by our standards sounds small until you remember that we're talking about an imperial world and only 47 countries that existed as of 1907. So 44 of 47 countries are present. And over that period, from June of 1907 until October of 1907, these nations accomplished unanimous agreement in a structure that involved lots of subcommittee dialogue, and then plenary session, deliberation and voting, and unanimous agreement on 13 resolutions, including many conceptual advances in developing more humane and restrained rules of conduct in war. That, you'll remember, was, from the United States perspective, the secondary objective. The primary objective was the international court, arbitration. And this Second Hague Conference achieved much less success in the realm of arbitration. It did not outlaw war, and it created no binding, independent international court process to step into international disputes and to adjudicate in advance grievances that might otherwise escalate into warfare. Instead, the nations simply reached in principle a discussion resolution that would be desirable as some later accomplishment. But that was not for want of trying. And trying is part of what I'm hoping to sketch here for you as we consider these points in time. It's important to note here and now, 100 years later, almost to the day, because this is a late August 1907 process that I'm about to describe, the leading role and the philosophy of the United States government at The Hague, at that second conference. The United States was, at that gathering, the neutral nation. It was not invested in or tainted by the interests and clashes of the continental European empires. The United States was, at that gathering, the proponent, from President Roosevelt's call for the conference, to the diplomats he sent, to the arguments they raised, to the drafts that they propounded, of a real, empowered international court of arbitration. The United States vision explicitly was willing to, and publicly did, advocate sacrificing some sovereignty in the interest of international justice. The particulars are striking to consider, because this is the United States proposal for the new and binding court membership that it advocated. A tribunal of 15 judges. Now you might say, well, court packing, right? Here it comes. No. The 15 would be, on the United States proposal, comprised of 9 judges from Europe, 2 from Asia, and only 4 from the United States. In other words, we propose to be bound by a majority institution and tribunal comprised not of ourselves. We were not successful, the United States, but we were determined to continue this pursuit, including at a third Hague conference and those thereafter. And it was agreed, as one of the subsidiary accomplishments of 1907, that these meetings would recur at regular 8-year intervals. In other words, we would next gather the nations of the world in 1915 to continue this process of development toward international law, which of course never happened, because by 1915, Europe was at war. The United States soon would join that war to end all wars. Much blood would be shed for very little purpose, and this conversation, 1899, 1907, in a sense, becomes transformed. As of fall 1907, however, the Hague Conference, the second conference, had accomplished quite a bit. It had accomplished in global discourse visibility for these principles of law and justice. It had educated effectively across nations and peoples in the names of these concepts and ideas and objectives. And particularly, it had had something of a galvanic effect on some Americans, many Americans, I venture to guess, but let me just flag 4 for you. One was a professor and a budding New Jersey politician named Woodrow Wilson. Another was a young lawyer and a world traveler and a very close watcher of President Theodore Roosevelt. Indeed, he emulated him in many regards. His name was Frank Roosevelt. A third, locally, in Frewsburg, just a few miles south of here, was a 15-year-old voracious newspaper reader and a rising high school junior, a very active interscholastic debater on policy issues, including, in the next couple of years, this very question, Robert Howard Jackson. And a fourth, even more obscurely, in Missouri, was another young student whose talents and efforts would, in later years, carry him to war and business failure, and machine politics, and ultimately some greater success, Harry S. Truman. A third point in time, the interval that separates this pre-World War I Second Hague Conference moment from the late 1930s and the Nuremberg moment. I can't do more in this forum than simply note it is there, it is vast, it is significant. It includes, of course, the war. It includes, of course, the Allied victory. It includes the 14 points. It includes Paris. It includes the effort, failing though it was, to prosecute war criminals at Leipzig. It includes the Kellogg-Briand Pact in the 1920s and its declaration that war is now against the legal principles of nations. A fourth phase that follows on that is, of course, the brink of war. 1940 and 1941 is the particular moment I want you to think about. And focusing on 2 of those people and 2 particular moments, this is an echo of the Second Hague Conference that one can see visibly. The first is a deal between the United States and Great Britain, culminated in the late summer of 1940, to provide 50 overage American destroyers from the World War I era inventory to Great Britain, which by that fall stood alone against the Nazis and was being obliterated by U-boats on the Atlantic. In return, the United States, the trading party, got 99-year basing rights on British territorial properties throughout the North Atlantic and the Caribbean. The basis for destroyer deals of President, now Franklin D. Roosevelt, is a controversial, in the face of neutrality legislation, in the face of international criticism, involvement by a country that's deeply isolationist, and an involvement of questionable legality. The lawyer who works it, agonizes about it, advises against the first phase, causes it to be reconfigured, and then approves it in a fairly sophisticated legal opinion is the Attorney General of the United States, the 15-year-old debater now in his 40s, Robert H. Jackson. That discussion during that summer is filled with the words, "Der Heil." A second moment, also portrayed directly from Jackson's recollections and insights in his memoir, That Man, which I had the luck to discover and the privilege to publish, is a speech that Jackson gave in Havana to the International Bar of the Americas in March of 1941. Actually, he only wrote it. Rough seas prevented him from getting to Havana. So if you had hard travels, it once was tougher to get to places. But what Jackson explained in that speech, building on the destroyer deal and the Lend-Lease program that was now being legislated and other military production escalations that were occurring in the United States, was that the United States was legally entitled to do this because Germany's aggressive military moves in the European continent and against Britain were illegal under customary international law and treaty commitments. That aggression was illegal. And in that speech and in those discussions, which includes Roosevelt and Jackson, they talk going back to The Hague in 1907. A fifth moment is Nuremberg itself, 1945, 1946. And here others of many higher credentials than my own will do the primary discussing, so I want to just touch on a few points. One is that Robert Jackson, now a Supreme Court justice, gets this post-war job to prosecute Nazi war criminals directly from the new president, Harry Truman, executing a plan of the old president, the late Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it brings him into lots of War Department and State Department and other activity that he was not privy to. In the ramping up phase in May of 1945, one of the things, among many, many, that Jackson learns about is actually a Treasury proposal, become War Department plan, become San Francisco Conference proposal to use German people as repair labor forces both across the European continent and in the Soviet Union. The numbers being proposed by the United States government and Great Britain are north of 1 million Germans. Jackson gets wind of this, which is close to a done deal. This is a topic of Yalta and London and San Francisco and the vengeance and the injury of these Allied victors, and invokes the Hague Conference. He says, I will not do this job on behalf of governments that are about to embark on slave labor, when that is part of the conduct that is to be investigated and, if possible, prosecuted and adjudicated by the thing I've been asked to take on. It runs, and these are his exact words, directly in the face of the commitments that the nations of the world made at both Hague conferences and the subsequent treaty obligations impose on us. And the entire American government blinks, which causes this proposal largely to fall apart. A second aspect of Nuremberg occurs actually in London. There is a legal, diplomatic negotiation process that Jackson has to do before he gets to Nuremberg. And what they are convening there among the four Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, is in some sense a descendant of the process that perhaps began in 1899, much more vigorously occurred in 1907, continued in Paris following World War I, and so forth. It is an international discussion of legal progress and shared principles. That produces the agreement and the charter that creates Nuremberg and the first International Criminal Tribunal. And that's the third thing I'd like to tick off just briefly. They then went to Nuremberg and did it. A fair, public trial before an independent tribunal. Perhaps based on a legal invention. Perhaps ex post facto in a former criminal law sense. In my view, more likely a legitimate criminal law development in the string of developments up to that point in time. But in either case, now, at the culmination of Nuremberg, a precedent going forward that henceforth the waging of aggressive war, the commission of war crimes, the perpetration of crimes against humanity, and common plan, agreement, and conspiracy to engage in any and all of those is against the body of international law as a crime for which not only organizations but individuals up to the level of heads of state can be held accountable. But of course, what does that mean? as Nuremberg culminates in the fall of 1946. Could the second half of the 20th century, and later, our young century, redeem or begin the process of redeeming the war and the bloodshed that characterized the first part of the 20th century? And thus, phase 6, 1946 and onward, looking forward from Nuremberg. Let me first read a few of Jackson's eloquent words. This is from his October 7, 1946 report, home from Nuremberg after the one and only international trial, to Harry Truman, the man who sent him, reporting how he, Jackson, did the job as a predicate to formally resigning responsibility. And this is Jackson's summary of what Nuremberg amounted to. The Nuremberg trial has put that handwriting on the wall for the oppressor as well as the oppressed to read. Of course, it would be extravagant to claim that agreements or trials of this character can make aggressive war or persecution of minorities impossible, just as it would be extravagant to claim that our federal laws make federal crimes impossible. But we cannot doubt that they strengthen the bulwarks of peace and tolerance. The four nations, through their prosecutors and through their representatives on the tribunal, have enunciated standards of conduct which bring new hope to men of goodwill, and from which future statesmen will not lightly depart. These standards by which the Germans have been condemned will become the condemnation of any nation that is faithless to them. By the agreement and this trial, we have put international law squarely on the side of peace as against aggressive warfare, and on the side of humanity as against persecution. In the present depressing world outlook, it is possible that the Nuremberg trial may constitute the most important moral advance to grow out of this war. The trial and decision by which the four nations have forfeited the lives of some of the most powerful political and military leaders of Germany because they have violated fundamental international law does more than anything in our time to give international law what Woodrow Wilson described as the kind of vitality it can only have if it is a real expression of our moral judgment. A fairly optimistic and high and perhaps self-congratulatory assessment of his own work. But of course, he is writing Truman and articulating this at a moment when the Cold War has begun, perhaps literally in the courtroom at Nuremberg, when a decision has been made by Great Britain and the United States on the direct recommendation of Jackson to attempt no more international trials, and when the prospect of a World War III is a real thing. That fall, Jackson wrestles privately with the question of what he should say, publicly and privately, about the United States government seeking the new United Nations to formally adopt the Nuremberg Principles, the Charter, and the judgment of the International Military Tribunal. It's captured, among other places, in an exchange that Jackson has privately with Walter Lippmann, the great American columnist, opinion shaper, a visitor to the Nuremberg trial earlier that year. On November 16, 1946, Jackson writes to Lippmann, privately, a note of caution, as Jackson describes it. I am fearful that in the present temper of things, more ground may be lost than gained by going to the United Nations for a vote. The United Nations, which has been structured to give the Soviets a Security Council veto. I hope my fears are ungrounded. In December of 1946, the United States does participate, the Soviets do participate in a UN adoption of the Nuremberg judgment, and to that extent, the international community ratifies Nuremberg. But the Cold War also is continuing. And the next place that Jackson describes as, I'll briefly describe, is right here. at Chautauqua Institution in the amphitheater just up the hill from us on the 4th of July, 1947. What Jackson articulates there is two things, somewhat in tension. An awareness of the international situation and a caution. Nuremberg is progress. International disputes and the challenge of coexistence are even bigger now in a nuclear age in the US-Soviet bipolarity. But one can still be hopeful. And one who has worked in the realm of diplomacy, projects, in international law, with that adversary, as I, Robert Jackson, have, he told the Chautauqua audience on that 4th of July, can have hope that a World War III with the Soviets is not inevitable. And that Nuremberg is in Banff on September 1, 1949 to the Canadian Bar Association. Jackson says there, in that time of high international tension and international paralysis, that Nuremberg, in appreciation of what we already have in the bank from Nuremberg, is now needed more than ever. Because the machinery, 1949, to make new international law is so inadequate, inertia is so great, conflict and suspicion today are so paralyzing that we can foresee no time when aggressive wars will be outlawed or their perpetrators legally punished if the Nuremberg basis for doing so was not valid. Finally, within a year of the end of his life, November 1953, Robert Jackson speaks to this meaning and legacy and force of Nuremberg in Chicago. The date is November 2, 1953. He's giving a speech dedicating the American Bar Association Center, a newly constructed, majestic, bold legal process spearheaded by the executive director of the ABA at the time, Whitney R. Harris, who's here with us. And in Chicago, this is, I think, a closing word from Jackson's perspective. The basic ideas of just dealing and civilized living are so strikingly alike among lawyers that we may foresee a mutual understanding and cooperation between the professions of the Western world greater than has existed in the past. And if a peaceful and stable international order is ever reached, it is not rash to predict that it will result from acceptance by the legal professions of all nations of an international rule of law as a curb on lawless power in control of great states. In other words, lawyers, international lawyers, have what Nuremberg put in the bank, share it in their levels of understanding, pursue it in their projects, and embody it in their personal commitments. And that's, of course, where we are today. That's who sits before me and with all of us, and who we will be hearing wonderful dialogues from. The significance of the international prosecutors who are here from 1945 and forward is that they carry on the Nuremberg process, which is the Hague Project, which is humanity's project. They sought in the past, and they seek today, accountability and fairness and world building and deterrence. And Nuremberg is young. Thank you very much.